This is a story of thousands of young Americans dropped onto barren, hostile hilltops to build disposable homes for artillery, trapped in a relentless cycle of brutal labor and unbearable waiting. It's a tale of the Firebase grunts, who faced a war not of sweeping battles, but of shovels, sandbags, and the constant unseen threat that turned their own outpost into a psychological prison. What unfolds will immerse you in the suffocating reality of life between the shelling, expose the unique torment of guarding against an enemy you can't see, and reveal how these temporary patches of dirt became the most permanent experience of a soldier's life. Before we begin this journey together, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who understands that history is lived in the mundane and miserable moments between the explosions, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. In the mid-1960s, American strategy in Vietnam hit a wall. The enemy operated deep in jungles and mountains, far beyond the reach of artillery parked at permanent coastal bases. Infantry patrols ventured into these zones utterly alone, cut off from fire support. The solution required a fundamental shift in thinking. Commanders looked at topographic maps and saw not obstacles, but opportunities. Isolated hilltops could be transformed into disposable artillery platforms, temporary strongholds built to project power, not just hold ground. The concept was simple yet radical: bring the guns to the enemy. Engineers, using bulldozers slung beneath CH-47 Chinook helicopters, would scrape a hilltop bald. Then the essential cargo arrived: 105mm or 155mm howitzers, enough infantry to form a perimeter, and the supplies to sustain them. These were not permanent forts; they were tactical tools, meant to exist for weeks or months before being abandoned or dismantled. They were named Fire Support Bases, FSBs, and their purpose was explicit. Each base housed howitzers with a lethal radius of 10 to 15 kilometers. When a grunt patrol in the valley below made contact, they called for help. Within minutes, shells would arc from the hilltop to precise coordinates below. The elevated position gave range, the forward placement gave speed. By 1966, dozens of these fortified islands, with names like Bastogne, Marianne, or simply a number, dotted the hostile map. For the thousands of young Americans sent to man them, life on a firebase occupied a purgatorial middle ground. It was not the mobile danger of the frontline infantry, but it was certainly not the safety of the rear. Artillerymen fired missions endlessly. Infantrymen manned the bunkers and wire. Everyone lived in the same cramped, dusty, or muddy patch of dirt, connected to the world only by the steady thrum of helicopters. When soldiers first arrived at a firebase, the work began before the helicopter dust settled. They were handed shovels and empty sandbags. The initial confusion, thinking it was mere manual labor, vanished the moment they understood these bags of dirt would be the walls between them and shrapnel. Survival was measured in cubic feet of excavated earth. The defining ritual was filling sandbags. In pairs under the punishing sun, one man held open the coarse canvas while the other shoveled. Backs ached, hands blistered, and stacks grew slowly along a nascent perimeter. Simultaneously, others dug into the hillside, carving out 9-foot square holes that would become bunkers. Progress was agonizingly slow through rock-hard clay or collapsing sand. These holes, roofed with scavenged corrugated steel and buried under yet more sandbags, were not homes. They were survival boxes, held together by wire, sweat, and determination. The firebase took shape around the guns. Howitzers were positioned in circular sandbagged pits for 360-degree coverage. The thunderous crump of outgoing fire became the base's relentless heartbeat, a sound felt in the chest more than heard, until it faded into a constant ringing background noise. But construction never truly ended. The Vietnamese climate warred against their labors. Concertina wire, heavy and vicious, was strung along the perimeter, leaving fresh scratches on every forearm. Claymore mines were placed with geometric precision beyond the wire, their firing lines snaking back to bunkers. Every day was maintenance, resagging wire, replacing split sandbags, recalibrating angles. The work was relentless, but it provided a brutal, purposeful rhythm. As the bunkers were completed, a subtle shift occurred. Soldiers moved in, claiming corners of the dank spaces. They pinned up magazine photos, painted unit insignia and dark jokes on the sandbag walls, and built crude shelves from ammo crates. In making these holes personal, they carved out tiny pockets of control and identity. The bunkers also became unintended social hubs, cramped, dark spaces where men gathered to play cards, write letters, and share fears they'd voice nowhere else. Life was a battle against the elements. In the monsoon, bunkers flooded, turning into muddy cisterns where mold bloomed and boots rotted. In the dry season, a fine red dust coated everything, and the underground boxes became suffocating ovens. They ate from aging C-ration cans, often using a pinch of C4 plastic explosive, stable, hot-burning, and strictly not for cooking, to heat their meals. Water, flown in on helicopters and tasting of purification tablets, was rationed like gold. Amid this grind, two constants defined their existence: the threat of indirect fire and the agony of guard duty. The rocket attacks came without pattern, often in the dead of night. A sound like a freight train tearing the sky would precede the first 122mm impact. Then a desperate sprint in the dark, counting seconds to the nearest bunker. Inside, men pressed against sandbag walls, feeling concussions ripple through the earth, listening to shrapnel ping off steel, and waiting in shared silence for the all-clear. The attacks were brief, violent punctuation marks in long sentences of routine. They trained men to sleep lightly, boots and helmet always within reach. Guard duty was a different, slower torture. After 12 hours of manual labor, soldiers spent 4 more staring into an ink-black tree line 50 meters away. The enemy was not an army, but a whisper. The NVA sapper, a specialist who could spend hours silently cutting through wire, cloaked in mud to mask his scent. Exhaustion was the real adversary. Men pinched their cheeks, squeezed rocks in their pockets, and chugged bitter, cold, instant coffee to stay awake through the 3 a.m. witching hour. The goal was simple: make it to rotation without getting yourself or your buddies killed. This was the Firebase stress, not the acute terror of a firefight, but a constant, low-grade anxiety. Danger wasn't on a map. It was in the unseen jungle, the random time of day, the unexploded rocket that might find your bunker. Soldiers adapted. They learned to distinguish incoming from outgoing by sound alone. They memorized the fastest sprint path from anywhere on the hill. They developed a functional numbness, a way to live atop a powder keg. Then, as abruptly as it began, word would come: the Firebase was closing. The process reversed. They pulled claymores, coiled rusted wire, and watched as Chinooks airlifted the howitzers away. The bunkers they'd personalized were left as open scars in the earth. On the final flight out, looking down at the shrinking hilltop, men saw a temporary scar already being reclaimed by the green. Their home was not a place, but the memory of the labor, the fear, and the fragile community they had built there, soon to be erased by the jungle. Most firebases were never reoccupied. Monsoon rains dissolved sandbag walls, and the jungle steadily erased the scarred hilltops. Within months, the only traces were buried shrapnel and the memories of the men who had built them, men who moved on to the next hill and the next until their tours finally ended. But the experience never left. At reunions and in VFW halls, the stories emerged. Veterans who served at bases with different names, Boston, Ripcord, and Marianne, discovered they had lived the same life, the same back-breaking labor, the same canned rations heated with C4, the same endless watch on the same dark tree line. This universal grind created a bond that bypassed unit patches and geography, forging connections that lasted a lifetime. For some, physical impermanence was a haunting paradox. They had poured their sweat and fear into fortifications that were now vanished, leaving the struggle feeling strangely ephemeral. Others, however, extracted a harder wisdom. The Firebase taught them how to function under relentless pressure, to find dark humor in misery, and to endure far more than they thought possible. These were brutal lessons, but they proved invaluable long after the war. While the jungle reclaimed the land, the community of veterans endured. They found each other through associations and later online, sharing faded photographs pulled from attics. The only tangible proof of bunkers, gun pits, and hand-painted signs that no longer existed. In the end, the Firebases achieved permanence only in memory. They were temporary solutions in a transient war, designed to be abandoned. Yet for the men who lived there, those patches of dirt became a profound and permanent home. It was where they learned the limits of their own endurance. That knowledge, forged in mud and sustained by camaraderie, proved more indelible than any fortified position. The jungle could reclaim the hilltops, but it could never erase the experience.